Today, we're going to be talking about Framing 101 from the Frameworks reading. So let me start with this. Let me start with a scenario that most of you have probably lived through. It's 6:30 in the morning. You're reviewing a draft press statement about an incident that unfolded overnight. The facts are still developing, the community is already reacting, elected officials are asking questions, and social media is doing what social media does. The draft in front of you is technically correct. Every word has been vetted. It's cautious, it's professional. And yet, if you release it exactly as written, it may calm things down or it may inflame them. It may reassure the public or it may signal defensiveness. Or it may reinforce legitimacy or quietly erode it. Same facts, same incident, same agency, different impact. Why is that? That's what we're here to talk about today. Because whether you intend to or not, you are shaping how people interpret what's happening. You're shaping whether they see an issue as isolated or systemic, whether they see it as a matter of individual behavior or broader conditions, whether they believe progress is possible or that decline is just inevitable. And here's the part that matters for experienced professionals like yourself. At your level, communication's not informational, it is strategic governance. You're not just reporting events, you're influencing how communities understand safety, responsibility, fairness, and the role of public institutions. You are influencing what solutions feel legitimate, and you are influencing what becomes politically possible. That, in a nutshell, my friends, is framing. And it happens every time you speak at a council meeting, in a roll call, at a town hall, in a policy memo, or even in a hallway conversation with a superior who will then carry your words downstream. There is no neutral communication. The only real question is this: are you framing intentionally or accidentally? Because when framing is accidental, the audience fills in the blanks. And when they fill in the blanks, they often default to individual blame, inevitability, or distrust. But when framing is strategic, grounded in values, context, and credible solutions, you expand what people think is possible. And that's the leadership edge. Today, we're going to break down what framing actually is: not a political tactic, not a spin, but as a professional tool, a governance tool, a legitimacy tool. We'll look at how small communication choices shape interpretation, how interpretation drives support, and how support ultimately determines whether reforms, policies, and safety strategies can move forward. So, as you move into the core idea, I want you thinking about your own communications, not just what you say, but what your message teaches people about how to think. Let's start with a foundational question: what is framing, really? Let's start with this hard truth. You are framing every time you communicate, every email, press release, town hall, social post. The memo is pushing a story about what the problem is, who caused it, and what should be done. In other words, every communication is framed. There is no such thing as neutral communications. So, real question isn't whether you're framing, it's whether you're framing strategically or accidentally. Framework defines framing as the choices we make in what we say, how we say it, what we emphasize, and what we leave unsaid. And those choices shape how people think, feel, and act. If you want the simplest formula, it's this: framing is choices that drive interpretation, and interpretation drives action. A frame is basically a guide, it tells people where to look, how to interpret what they see, And frames don't show up as one big obvious thing, they're built like a mosaic, piece by piece, through dozens of small communication choices. So here's what matters. In public safety, frames determine whether people see an issue as a private, personal problem or a shared social concern. And that shift changes what solutions the public will support. Frames steer whether audiences interpret an issue as a personal slash private or shared slash social, and that shift changes what they see as fair, realistic, and legitimate solutions. So think about this, and this is a conversation around the concept of charity versus justice in the framework model. So here's a simple tool how you can use this immediately to determine the difference between charity frame and justice frame. A charity frame tends to focuses on the needy and the visible symptom. It invites sympathy and asks individuals to help. Put quite simply, charity says help them and it pushes towards individual action. A justice frame highlights how society is set up, fairness, systems, and conditions, and it calls for collective action to make things right. Put simply, justice says fix conditions and it pushes towards collective action. So let's think about a scenario in the real world of public safety, and one that comes to mind would be homelessness. If we frame homelessness as those people need services, please donate and volunteer, that's a charity framework. But if we frame it as housing instability is produced by policy choices, rent burden, wage, treatment access, zoning, reentry barriers, etc. So we need a coordinated system fix. That's a justice frame. Same issue, different frame. And the second one makes policy solutions feel legitimate and necessary because it helps the public see the conditions producing the problem. Frameworks breaks why framing matters into four outcomes. Next, understanding. Most people don't think about social issues the way experts do, so framing expands their mental models. Third, support. Understanding alone doesn't create change. People have to support solutions, and framing helps them see that progress is possible. And fourth, demand. Shared framing can build narratives that generate demand for a more just response. So when you write a message, ask yourself, what am I trying to move here? Awareness, understanding, support, or demand? Because if your message only produces awareness, you might get attention, but you won't get durable backing for change. Now, how do you intentionally do framing? Frameworks names a set of frame elements. Think of them as, well, knobs. I'm going to give you the ones that do the work for you for public safety. If you remember these as set, remember this: high leverage elements, values, context, explanatory change, solutions, and tone. Context sets the scene and helps people see how systems and policies shape outcomes, not just individual choices. Here's a practical takeaway. If you don't provide context, the audience will fill the gap with assumptions, usually individual blame. Second, explanatory chains. These connect the dots with clear causal links, which leads to, because of, the practical takeaway is simple. Don't list facts. Walk people through cause, mechanism, outcome. If you want understanding, you have to build it. Next, we'll speak to values, solutions, tone. Values, first, not last. Values prime a common good. and keep audiences open. So lead with shared values like safety, dignity, fairness, opportunity. Then move into explanation and solutions. Don't treat values as a closing line, treat them as the doorway, as the entry into the conversation. Solutions. Solutions increase the can do and point of collective responses, especially policy level solutions. As a practical takeaway, don't end with despair, end with a clear, credible path. Fifth, tone. An aspirational tone reaches a broader audience than a judgmental or argumentative one. Practical takeaway, you can be direct without sounding like you're lecturing or scolding. If you want your frame to travel, your tone has to let it travel. So now a warning, because some framing can backfire. One of the biggest framing mistakes, especially if the problem statement is accidentally cueing determinism, the idea that negative outcomes are inevitable. Frameworks gives an example where describing intergenerational risk can cue the impression that this will just keep happening, leaving people little hope of change. In short, avoid determinism, the message that it is inevitable. In public safety, determinism sounds a lot like this: crime is out of control. People don't respect anything anymore. This will only get worse. That language may feel urgent, but it can also quietly train the audience to think, why bother? Nothing works. Instead, pair urgency with credible solution path. Keep the problem real, but keep the future open. If you remember one line from today, make it this one. The only way to know if a frame works is to test it. Frames have surprising effects, and intuition leaves social change to chance. So, yes, be creative, but be evidence driven. Let me close this way. It brings us back to your level of responsibility in this framing issue and discussion. Framing is not a spin. It's not optics. It's not polishing language to make something sound better. It's leadership. Because when you frame an issue, you are teaching the public how to interpret reality. You are shaping whether they see complexity or chaos, whether they see responsibility or blame, and whether they see possibility or inevitability. And at the command level, that matters more than most people realize. If your communications unintentionally cues individual blame, the public will default to those people. If it cues inevitability, they will default to nothing works. And if it cues fragmentation, they will default to everyone's on their own. But if your framing cues shared responsibility, systemic understanding, and credible solutions, you expand the boundaries of what feels legitimate, fair, and achievable. That's not messaging, that's governance. And here's the professional standards we need to hold ourselves to. You don't get to say, well, that's just how people took it. If your frame produced misunderstanding, that's data. If your message produced resistance, that's data. And if your communication failed to generate durable support, that data. Serious leaders test their frames. They don't rely on instinct alone. They don't assume technical accuracy equals strategic effectiveness. They recognize that communication is intervention, and intervention should be designed, evaluated, and refined. So, as you move into the next activity, where you take a real statement and rebuild it using values, context, explanatory chains, solutions, and tone, I want you thinking at a higher level than word choice alone. Ask yourself, what interpretation does this message invite? What mental model does it reinforce? What does it make feel possible? And what does it make feel inevitable? Because once you see framing clearly, you cannot unsee it. You'll start to notice how quickly conversations collapse into blame. You'll recognize when urgency slides into determinism. And you'll hear when tone quietly undercuts legitimacy. And more importantly, you'll know how to fix it. That's the standard for professional public safety leadership in today's environment. Not louder, not defensive, not reactive. Strategic, intentional, evidence informed. All right, folks, that's the end of this session. I appreciate you watching to the end, and I look forward to more discussions in our live session. Take care.